Good day, class. Today, we are going to study about the Atlantic slave trade and the Columbian exchange. The Atlantic slave trade was one of the darkest chapters in human history, spanning from the 16th to the 19th century. It involved the forced transportation of millions of Africans to the Americas to work primarily on plantations. The trade was driven by economic, political, and social factors that shaped global history. Over time, the slave trade became a vast network involving European merchants, African rulers, and colonial plantation owners. The legacy of this inhumane system continues to influence societies today. One of the major causes of the Atlantic slave trade was the growing demand for cheap labor in the colonies, particularly in the Caribbean, Brazil, and the southern United States. European powers such as Portugal, Spain, Britain, France, and the Netherlands sought to expand their colonial economies through the production of cash crops like sugar, tobacco, and cotton. These labor-intensive industries required a large and inexpensive workforce, leading to the mass enslavement of African people. The process of the Atlantic slave trade followed what historians call the triangular trade. This system involved three main routes. European goods, such as weapons and textiles, were sent to Africa in exchange for enslaved people. These captives were then shipped across the Atlantic to the Americas in the horrific journey known as the Middle Passage. And finally, the produced goods from slave labor were sent back to Europe, completing the cycle. This trade enriched European economies while devastating African societies. The first Europeans to explore Africa were the Portuguese during the 1400s. Initially, Portuguese traders were more interested in trading for gold than for captured Africans. That changed with the colonization of the Americas as natives began dying by the millions. Europeans saw advantages in using African in the Americas. The question of why Africans became the primary victims of slavery is complex. First, many Africans had been exposed to European diseases and had built up some immunity. Second, many Africans had experience in farming and could be taught plantation work. Third, Africans were less likely to escape because they did not know their way around the new land. Fourth, their skin color made it easier to catch them if they escaped and tried to live among others. Additionally, racist ideologies developed over time, with Europeans justifying slavery by claiming that Africans were inherently inferior and suited for hard labor. European traders also exploited intertribal conflicts in Africa, supplying weapons to rival groups in exchange for captives. African leaders who participated in the trade sometimes saw it as a way to strengthen their own power, unaware of the massive depopulation and destruction it would cause. The Middle Passage was the horrific transatlantic journey that enslaved Africans endured from Africa to the Americas. This voyage, often lasting 6 to 8 weeks, was marked by extreme brutality. Captives were crammed into ships under inhumane conditions, with little space, food, or fresh air. Disease spread rapidly due to the unsanitary environment, and many died from malnutrition, dysentery, or smallpox before even reaching the New World. Historical records estimate that between 12 to 15 million Africans were forcibly taken across the Atlantic, but only about 10 million survived the journey. It is believed that at least 2 million captives perished during the Middle Passage, their bodies thrown overboard. Historical records indicate that only 10 to 12 million enslaved individuals reached the Americas, while at least 2 million perished due to disease, malnutrition, and horrific conditions aboard the slave ships. In African ports, European traders packed Africans into the dark holds of large ships. On board, Africans endured whippings and beatings from merchants, as well as diseases that swept through the vessel. Numerous Africans died from disease or physical abuse aboard the slave ship. Many others committed suicide by drowning. Among the major destinations for enslaved Africans, Brazil received the largest number, with approximately 4.9 million individuals forced into servitude, primarily working on sugar plantations. The Caribbean islands, including Jamaica, Haiti, and Cuba, became another major hub for slave labor, with around 4 to 5 million enslaved Africans brought to the region. In Spanish America, which included territories like Mexico and Peru, about 1.5 million Africans were transported to work in mines, plantations, and urban labor. Meanwhile, British North America and later the United States received a comparatively smaller number, estimated at 500,000 to 600,000. But slavery became deeply entrenched in the Southern economy. The Atlantic slave trade depended on specific ports and regions that became major hubs for capturing, selling, and transporting slaves. In Africa, key slave trading centers included Gorée Island, Senegal, Elmina, Ghana, Bonny, Nigeria, and Luanda, as Angola. These ports were controlled by European powers and African intermediaries who facilitated the sale of enslaved individuals. On the American side, the most prominent slave markets were in Brazil, especially in Salvador and Rio de Janeiro. The Caribbean, Jamaica, Barbados, and Haiti, and North America, Charleston, South Carolina, and New Orleans, Louisiana. Brazil alone received nearly 5 million enslaved Africans, making it the largest single destination for African slaves. The Caribbean was another major hub, with plantations in Cuba, Hispaniola, and Jamaica becoming heavily dependent on enslaved labor. The impact of the Atlantic slave trade was devastating for Africa, the Americas, and global history. Africa suffered severe population loss, with millions of young men and women taken away, leading to a decline in economic and social development. Entire communities were destroyed, and some African states, such as the Kingdom of Congo and Dahomey, became entangled in wars fueled by the slave trade. In the Americas, enslaved African contributed immensely to the economic prosperity of European colonies. The labor of enslaved people built economies based on sugar, cotton, and tobacco, making the Atlantic world highly profitable for European nations. However, this system also led to brutal exploitation, with enslaved people suffering forced labor, family separations, and extreme punishments. Despite the immense suffering, enslaved Africans resisted oppression in many ways, including rebellions, escape attempts, and cultural preservation. One of the most famous revolts was the Haitian Revolution, in 1791-1804, where enslaved people overthrew French rule and established the first Black Republic. Resistance also took the form of abolitionist movements in Europe and America, led by figures like Olaudah Equiano, Frederick Douglass, and William Wilberforce. Olaudah Equiano was a formerly enslaved African writer and abolitionist whose autobiography, The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olaudah Equiano, 1789, played a crucial role in the movement to end the Atlantic slave trade. Born in what is now Nigeria, Equiano was captured as a child and sold into slavery. He was transported through the Middle Passage to the Americas and later sold to a British naval officer. While enslaved, he was taught to read and write, eventually purchasing his own freedom in 1766. As a free man, Equiano became an active voice in the British abolitionist movement, using his personal experiences to expose the horrors of slavery. His autobiography became a powerful tool in the fight against the slave trade, influencing public opinion and policymakers. His work helped pave the way for the abolition of the Slave Trade Act in 1807. Eventually, growing opposition to slavery led to its abolition. Britain banned the slave trade in 1807, followed by the United States in 1808. The full abolition of slavery took longer, with Britain ending slavery in its colonies in 1833, the United States in 1865, and Brazil in 1888. The legacy of the Atlantic slave trade remains deeply ingrained in modern society. The forced migration of millions of Africans led to the formation of Afro-Caribbean, Afro-Latin American, and African-American cultures, which continue to influence music, religion, and traditions. However, the racial discrimination that justified slavery persisted even after its abolition, leading to segregation, racism, and systemic inequality in the Americas. Furthermore, the economic gap between Europe, Africa, and the Americas today is partially rooted in the exploitation of enslaved labor. European nations benefited economically, while African nations suffered long-term damage. The slave trade also set the foundation for colonial rule in Africa, as European nations later used similar tactics to dominate African lands. Thank you very much for watching.